Hello, and welcome to another session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books, featuring the Instant Expert Learning System. In the 19th century, many women writers had to write under assumed male names to get their works published. Most of them received little or no recognition for their work. This was certainly the case for Emily Bronte, the author of Wuthering Heights, the novel we are featuring in this session. Emily was the fourth daughter of the Reverend Patrick Brontë, a minister of the Church of England from County Down, Ireland, and Maria Branwell Brontë. When Emily was 3, her mother died of cancer, leaving 6 children to be cared for by their strict spinster Aunt Bess and their financially strapped father. In an attempt to educate his daughters, Reverend Bronte sent the 4 oldest sisters to the Clergy Daughters School at Cowan Bridge, where their tuition was supplemented by donations. But the horrible living conditions at the school contributed to the death of the 2 elder daughters, Maria and Elizabeth, from tuberculosis. As a result, Mr. Bronte brought Charlotte and Emily home, where their Aunt Bess taught them and their youngest sister, Anne, as best she could. Their only brother, Branwell, was taught by his father. In 1842, Emily and Charlotte, who became teachers to supplement the family's income, lived for 8 months in Brussels, Belgium, learning French, German, and music. By 1845, the 2 girls and their younger sister Anne were together at their Haworth home. It was during this period that they discovered their talent for poetry. In 1846, they published a book of poems under the assumed male names of Curate, Ellis, and Bell. When the book sold only 2 copies, the girls turned to the writing of fiction. After Charlotte's first novel, The Professor, failed, she produced Jane Eyre in 1847, which was an enormous hit. Later that same year, Emily's Wuthering Heights and Anne's Agnes Grey were published, also under their assumed male names. Both were also extremely successful. Since it had been speculated that all 3 books were written by the same author, Charlotte, who helped publish the second edition of Wuthering Heights in 1850, told the world who had actually written the 3 novels. By then, Anne and Emily had both died. When writing about her sister Emily, Charlotte portrayed her as a person with a fire for writing, but no worldly wisdom. However, Emily's work displayed a grasp of the realities of life that she was forced to deal with every day. The rules of inheritance of the period make up much of the plot in Wuthering Heights, and it is apparent from reading the book that Emily understood these rules as well as any man. Wuthering Heights is considered by many to be the most famous romantic novel in English. It is the story of Mr. Heathcliff and his 2 houses, Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. The story begins in 1801, when the story's principal narrator, Mr. Lockwood, described as a fashionable gentleman, rents Thrushcross Grange, a house in a lonely and desolate corner of northern England. Lockwood tells the reader that the house suits him perfectly because he is proud and antisocial. However, it isn't long until Lockwood decides to visit his landlord at Wuthering Heights. When the 2 men walk into the rustic wood and stone building, Lockwood notices the date 1500 and the name Hareton Earnshaw above the door. Once inside, the host leaves Lockwood and goes to the cellar for some wine. Lockwood tries to be friendly with Heathcliff's dogs, but they attack and have to be called off by Zillah, one of the servants. Although Heathcliff carries out his social responsibilities, it is obvious to Lockwood from the start that the man does not want to see him again. Yet Lockwood considers himself Heathcliff's social equal, has enjoyed his conversation, and plans to return, invited or not. We also learn early in the novel that the term wuthering refers to the wild winds that have ravaged the house during storms for centuries. The house has survived because it is made of large, rugged stones and huge, rough wooden timbers. Inclement weather almost keeps Lockwood from making his second trip to Wuthering Heights. However, he decides to visit anyway, and when he arrives at the house, it is snowing hard. He runs up the rock path to the front door, only to find it locked and barred. His furious knocking finally attracts Joseph, the servant, who refuses to admit him. At that moment, a young man carrying a pitchfork suddenly appears and leads Lockwood into the house through a washroom. Inside, he finds himself in the room where he met Heathcliff. Sitting in the room is a woman called the Missus. She is sullen-looking and remains silent, not even offering Lockwood a seat. He tries to start a polite conversation, but the woman ignores him. When she is about to make tea, she asks Lockwood if he is an invited guest. When he says no, she puts the tea away. Despite her incivility, Lockwood finds her hauntingly beautiful. She has a lovely figure, an exquisite face, and pretty eyes. With a pleasant expression on her face, Lockwood thinks she would be irresistible. At this point, Heathcliff comes into the room. He is in a foul mood, and is irritated that Lockwood has decided to visit him. Lockwood learns that the Mrs. is Heathcliff's daughter-in-law, Cathy, and that her husband, Heathcliff's son, and Heathcliff's wife are both dead. The young man with a pitchfork is named Hareton Earnshaw, and Lockwood does not remember that the name above the front door was also Hareton Earnshaw. Next, Lockwood asks for someone to guide him across the moors back to his home. He gets no response. When he asks to stay the night because of the storm, he again gets no reaction. Finally, he grabs a lantern, says he will return it the next day, and starts to walk away. Joseph, thinking that Lockwood is stealing the lantern, sets the dogs on him. He is knocked down and his nose bloodied. Only Zillah will help him. She washes his face, gives him a glass of brandy, and leads him to a bed. As Zillah is taking Lockwood to the room he will occupy, she tells him that Heathcliff does not usually let anyone enter it. Not having been at the house for very long, Zillah cannot explain why. In the room, Lockwood finds that 3 names have been scratched on a window ledge. They are Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Heathcliff, and Catherine Linton. After falling asleep, Lockwood is awakened when one of the candles in the room begins to burn a book. He sees that the book is titled Catherine Earnshaw, Her Book, and is dated 25 years ago. Interested, Lockwood begins to read. In one entry, Catherine writes of the death of her father and the cruelty of Hindley, her brother, the new master of Wuthering Heights. Catherine recalls one cold Sunday when Hindley and his wife are sitting before the fire while she and Heathcliff are forced to listen to a 3-hour sermon delivered in the cold by Joseph. When the 2 children object to some reading material that is forced upon them, Hindley is outraged. He says that Heathcliff is nothing but a vagabond that his father forced upon the family. He forbids Catherine to play with him under penalty of being sent away. Then he says that Heathcliff should no longer be considered a member of the family. At this point, Lockwood falls asleep and experiences 2 bizarre dreams. First, he dreams he is being guided home by Joseph, but he is led to a nearby chapel and subjected to a long, boring sermon. When he protests, he is shouted down and attacked with clubs by the preacher and the congregation. After being awakened by the rattling of dry fir cones against the window, the clubs of his dream, Lockwood falls asleep again. This time he dreams that a tapping on the window wakes him. He breaks the window and reaches through to snap off a twig that is making the noise. Instead, he grasps the small, cold hand of a child. He can't free himself from the hand, so he pulls the slender wrist against the broken glass, causing it to bleed. He hears a voice say, "20 years! I've been away for 20 years!" He awakes, screaming. Heathcliff comes running when he hears the scream. He is outraged that anyone was admitted to the room. Lockwood tells him of the dream, and Heathcliff then sends him out of the room. When he is alone, he breaks out in tears, opens the window, and says, come in, Cathy, do come. Oh, do once more. Oh, my darling, hear me this time. Catherine, at last." Downstairs, Lockwood finds a very unhappy household. Hareton Earnshaw is cursing. Zillah is suffering from her employer's anger, and the girl is defying the furious Heathcliff, who is trying to hit her. Finally, an exhausted Lockwood is escorted to Thrushcross Grange by his host. Heathcliff's impassioned call for Catherine is a great moment in the novel. It reveals Heathcliff as more than just an evil-tempered person by showing a sensitive and tortured side of him. After Lockwood has recovered from his ordeal at Wuthering Heights, he is brought food by Mrs. Ellen Dean, who for 18 years has been the housekeeper at Thrushcross Grange. He questions her about the people at Wuthering Heights, and Mrs. Dean becomes the second narrator of the story. Mrs. Dean, who will also be called Nellie in the story, was a servant at Wuthering Heights when the elder Mr. Earnshaw was the master. She took care of Mr. Earnshaw's 2 children, Hindley, age 14, and Catherine, age 6. One day, Mr. Earnshaw comes home from a trip with a young gypsy boy he has found abandoned. Those in the house react to the filthy child with disgust. Mrs. Earnshaw asks that the boy be removed from the house, and the children shy away from him. Finally, Mrs. Dean puts the boy outside on the landing for the night. imagining that he will probably be gone by morning. But Mr. Earnshaw protects the little orphan and names him Heathcliff. Over the years, he earns a place in the family. Cathy and Mrs. Dean develop a friendship for the boy, but Hindley considers him an intruder who has stolen his father's affections. Hindley beats Heathcliff and tells him he will drive him away after his father's death. Heathcliff, however, threatens to tell Hindley's father, and uses that power to get what he wants from Hindley. Of course, it is established that Hindley will drive Heathcliff away if and when he gets the chance. In his final days, Mr. Earnshaw becomes very protective of Heathcliff, thinking that everyone else hates the boy. In order to humor the old man, several members of the family spoil Heathcliff, and in the process anger Hindley even more. Finally, a local priest suggests that Hindley go away to college. Once he is gone, the house quiets down, except for occasional problems caused by Joseph and Cathy. Joseph is a religious fanatic, a self-righteous Pharisee, and Cathy is spirited and mischievous. She often purposely upsets her father. Soon Mr. Earnshaw dies, and Cathy and Heathcliff cry in anguish. They had good reason to cry, as Hindley returns and begins a tyrannical rule over Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff is sent to live with the servants and must work outside with the farmhands. His education is ended, and both he and Cathy are constantly singled out for punishment. One of their pleasures is to race across the moors together. One night they decide to pay a call on the Lintons at Thrushcross Grange in an effort to scare the spoiled Linton children. They are discovered, and when they try to run, Cathy is bitten on the ankle by a dog and is taken into the house for treatment. Heathcliff is driven away like a stray dog. When he gets back to Wuthering Heights, he is warned that if he ever speaks to Catherine again, he will be dismissed from the household permanently. Meanwhile, Cathy changes into a beautiful young woman during the 5 weeks she spends with the Lintons. She comes home dressed like a lady. In contrast, Heathcliff is grubby and dirty from his work on the estate. Wanting to put an end to the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff, Hindley invites Heathcliff to step forward like the other servants and greet Cathy. The boy, embarrassed by his appearance and awed by Cathy's transformation, runs away. The next day is a holiday, and with some encouragement from Nellie Dean, Heathcliff cleans himself up in hopes of gaining Cathy's forgiveness for the way he had acted before. His confidence restored, Heathcliff goes out to meet Cathy as she leaves the church after a service. But Hindley sees him first and chains him to a watchtower until after the midday meal. Meanwhile, Edgar, one of the Linton children, insults Heathcliff. In anger, he grabs the nearest thing available, a bowl of hot applesauce, and throws it in Edgar's face. After being beaten by Hindley, Heathcliff vows to get revenge on Edgar. In June of 1778, Hindley's son, Hareton Earnshaw, is born, but a few months later his mother dies of consumption. This tragedy makes Hindley even more difficult. He begins drinking heavily. Only Nellie, who is taking care of Hareton, and Joseph, whose vocation is to be where he had plenty of wickedness to improve, stay on. Hindley is particularly brutal to Heathcliff. Soon Wuthering Heights is virtually isolated. Hindley's actions are so bad that even the priest stops visiting. At 15, Cathy is one of the prettiest girls in the area. She is, however, arrogant and proud. Edgar Linton keeps trying to make an impression on her, but she still prefers Heathcliff. Incidentally, Nellie Dean is able to tell the story in detail because she has Cathy's confidence and talks with her a great deal. Heathcliff, who has lost interest in learning since he was banished to the fields, has also lost interest in his appearance. In fact, he is described as repulsive. One day, when Hindley is gone, Heathcliff visits Cathy in the parlour. Cathy is embarrassed by Heathcliff's visit because she is expecting Edgar. When the refined Edgar arrives, the slovenly Heathcliff slips out, leaving Cathy a clear comparison between the two men. Nellie Dean has orders from Hindley to stay with Edgar and Cathy. At first, Cathy urges the housekeeper to leave. Then she pinches her, slaps her face, and when Edgar attempts to intervene, she slaps his face too. Mrs. Dean thinks it is good that Edgar see what kind of a girl Cathy has become. But just when Edgar is thinking about walking out of the house for good, he realizes that he is hopelessly in love with Cathy. He stays at the house until Hindley returns, drunk and dangerous. Ellen tries to hide Hareton from his father, but Hindley discovers the child and terrifies him, making him cry. Hindley decides to spank the boy to make him stop crying. He grabs the child and starts upstairs. To terrify him further, Hindley dangles him over the balcony. Suddenly, he accidentally drops him. Fortunately, Heathcliff, who hasn't left the house, catches the child before it is dashed to death. Hindley returns to his drinking, ignoring the near death of his son. Instead of leaving the house as Hindley is ordered, Heathcliff sits near the kitchen where he can overhear anything that is said. Nellie puts Hareton to bed, and soon Cathy enters and tells Nellie that she has accepted a proposal of marriage from Edgar. Cathy admits to loving Heathcliff, but says that a marriage to him would degrade her, while a marriage to Edgar would mean money and position. Heathcliff leaves Wuthering Heights and does not return. After 3 years, during which Edgar's parents die from fever, Cathy and Edgar are married. Nellie follows Cathy to Thrushcross Grange, leaving Hareton, now 5 years old, in the care of his mad and drunken father. It is very late, so Mrs. Dean stops telling her story and leaves Lockwood to sleep. The story resumes 4 weeks later after a visit from Heathcliff makes Lockwood curious to hear more. He summons Mrs. Dean and she agrees to continue her tale. For a time after the marriage, things go rather well for the new couple. Then, after a 3-year absence, Heathcliff suddenly appears. He has transformed himself into a tall, handsome, athletic man, and seems to have money, although its source is never revealed. Cathy is thrilled to see him, showing a passion for him that angers her new husband. Heathcliff tells Cathy that she has inspired his desire to improve himself, and that he will not be driven away again. He adds that he had actually come back to settle his score with Hindley and then kill himself, but has changed his mind since seeing her. Cathy is excited by Heathcliff's visit, which annoys Edgar. Finally, Heathcliff leaves, saying that he is going to live at the Heights with Hindley to stay close to Cathy. At first, Heathcliff's goal is to irritate Edgar by paying attention to his wife. But soon Edgar has to face another worry. His sister Isabella decides she is in love with Heathcliff. Knowing that if he should die, his property would pass to the nearest male heir, Edgar realizes Heathcliff would inherit the land if he were married to Isabella. Cathy tells Heathcliff that Isabella loves him. At first he is insulted, but later, when he realizes that a marriage to Isabella might be financially profitable, he reconsiders. Reflected in this section of the book is Emily Bronte's clear understanding of the English inheritance laws of the time. Returning to the story, Nellie has a vision that she believes to be an omen of death for Hindley. She hurries to Wuthering Heights to see if her fears are justified. There she meets Hareton, the young boy whom she had cared for until 10 months before. Hareton doesn't seem to recognize her, and every other word is a curse. Talking further to Hareton, she finds that Heathcliff has forbidden the priest to come and teach the youngster, and is treating him as badly as he had been treated by Hindley. In addition, he is teaching Hareton to hate his father. When Heathcliff visits Thrushcross Grange, he finds Isabella outside, and thinking they are alone, he tries to kiss her. Isabella is frightened and runs off. Having often heard Heathcliff express contempt for Isabella, Nellie, who is watching, yells, "Judas! Traitor!" loud enough for Cathy to overhear. A quarrel between Cathy and Heathcliff ensues. Knowing that he cares nothing about Isabella, Cathy says if he really cared about her, he would ask Edgar for her hand in marriage. Heathcliff responds that if he wanted to marry Isabella, he wouldn't bother to ask anyone. Thinking that the argument is more serious than it is, Nellie tells Edgar. Angered, he tells Heathcliff to leave the house. Heathcliff taunts Edgar until Edgar overcomes his fear enough to strike him solidly in the throat before running out of the house. Heathcliff recovers quickly and leaves. Upset, Cathy tells Nellie that if Edgar will not allow her to have Heathcliff as a friend, she will destroy herself. When Edgar arrives, he demands that Cathy choose between him and Heathcliff. Cathy responds by pretending to be ill. She goes to her room and stays there for several days without food and water. Meanwhile, Edgar, who spends his time in the library, doesn't take her illness seriously. During this period, Edgar tries to get his sister Isabella to say she is upset by Heathcliff's advances, but she won't. Edgar then says he will have no more to do with her if she continues to encourage Heathcliff. Meanwhile, Cathy becomes delirious and appears to have suffered a relapse of the fever that she had had previously. She imagines her impending death and talks about where she will be buried. When Edgar discovers her condition, he sends Nellie to get a doctor. Outside, Nellie finds Isabella's pet dog hung cruelly from a hook in the wall and thinks she hears hoofbeats. Later, as she is escorting the doctor to the Grange, she learns that when Heathcliff had tried to kiss Isabella 3 days before, it was after he had asked her to run away with him. Isabella had postponed her elopement by saying she would be ready the next time he asked. Nellie finds Isabella's room empty, and the next morning a maid confirms that the couple had been seen some miles away. During the next 2 months, nothing is heard from Heathcliff and Isabella. Edgar concerns himself with nursing Cathy back to health from what is called brain fever, a 19th century malady found mostly in novels. Soon Cathy's strength improves, and Edgar is hopeful because she is about to have a baby, possibly a boy that would thwart Heathcliff's hopes to inherit Thrushcross Grange. 6 weeks later, Edgar receives a letter from Isabella, who is with Heathcliff, Hindley, and Hareton at Wuthering Heights. She is in desperate need of friendship and help. Edgar ignores it. 2 weeks later, Isabella writes Nellie. She says she fears Heathcliff is mad, that Hindley fears that he will have nothing left to will his son. Hareton looks for an opportunity to commit murder, and Heathcliff, still angry at Edgar for causing Cathy's illness, is taking his frustrations out on Isabella. She begs for Nellie to visit her. When Nellie visits, she finds that Isabella is totally dominated by Heathcliff. She is so demoralized that her only wish is for death for herself or Heathcliff. Nellie asks why she doesn't leave, and Isabella replies that Heathcliff will not let her, even though he tells others she is free to go. Later, Heathcliff convinces Nellie that Isabella is out of her mind and gives her a letter from him to take to Catherine. After returning to Thrushcross Grange, Nellie is reluctant to give Heathcliff's letter to Catherine because she doesn't know how Catherine will react to it. Finally, 4 days later, Catherine, who is described as looking near death, gets Heathcliff's note. She reads it. Then, almost at that moment, she learns that he is downstairs. When he arrives in the room, he and Catherine fall into a wild, uncontrollable embrace. Seeming to know that Cathy is doomed and that they will not see each other again, they blame each other for the circumstances that kept them from becoming man and wife. Just then, Edgar returns from church. Nellie tells Heathcliff that he better leave the house before Edgar sees him. But Catherine won't let go of Heathcliff. Fortunately, just as Edgar enters the room, Catherine lapses into unconsciousness in Heathcliff's arms. Edgar is livid with rage, but Heathcliff hands the lifeless-looking girl to Edgar and tells him to help her first. Anxious about Catherine, Edgar temporarily forgets about Heathcliff, who is hurried out of the house by Nellie. Nellie tries to persuade him to go back to Wuthering Heights, but he insists on spending the night in the garden to be near Catherine. At midnight, the young Catherine, whom Lockwood had met during his second visit to Wuthering Heights, is born, and 2 hours later, her mother dies without ever regaining consciousness. Edgar is shattered by his wife's death, and the thought that Heathcliff, through his sister Isabella, will inherit the Linton estate should he die. He totally ignores his newly born daughter, who is being cared for by Nellie. When she gets the chance, Nellie quietly slips out of the house and tells Heathcliff what has happened. But Heathcliff has already heard from one of the servants, and is devastated that Catherine could leave him. "May she wake in torment," Heathcliff says. "Take any form, drive me mad, only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. I cannot live without my life. I cannot die without my soul." It is an attitude that Heathcliff will carry to his death, and explains his strange actions during Lockwood's second visit to Wuthering Heights. The day after the funeral, Isabella arrives at the Grange and says she has escaped from Heathcliff. She tells a harrowing story. When Heathcliff returned from the funeral, Hindley, who had been drinking heavily, decided to kill him. Isabella warns Heathcliff of Hindley's intention, but conspires with him to lock Heathcliff out of the house. Outraged, Heathcliff breaks a window and starts to crawl in. Hindley tries to attack him, but Heathcliff disarms him and beats him until he is near death. The next morning, Heathcliff is in a stupor over Catherine's death, and Hindley is ill from his drinking and the beating. Isabella, who could no longer stand the sight of Heathcliff, goads him into throwing a knife at her, which nicks her under her right ear. She runs away, and Hindley prevents Heathcliff from following her by grabbing him. Isabella keeps running until she reaches the Grange. After finishing her story, Isabella leaves for her new home near London and never returns to Thrushcross Grange. A few months later, Isabella gives birth to a son, Linton. When Heathcliff learns of her hiding place, he doesn't visit her, but says if he ever wants the child, he'll come and get it. Isabella dies 13 years later without seeing Heathcliff again. 6 months after Catherine's death, Hindley dies. By this time, he has accumulated huge gambling debts to Heathcliff, thus owing him virtually everything he owns. Meanwhile, Edgar Linton finally acknowledges he has a daughter and finds a new reason for living. She is called Cathy to differentiate her from her mother. Cathy is a beautiful, agreeable child who is kept isolated from the rest of the world. Then, one day, when her father is visiting the ailing Isabella near London, she slips away from the house, comes across Hareton on the road, and goes with him to Wuthering Heights. Since Heathcliff has intentionally not educated Hareton, who is now 18, he is crude and uncouth, and Cathy can't believe he is her cousin. Nellie manages to find Cathy and convinces her not to tell her father of the adventure. Soon Isabella dies, and her son Linton comes to live with Cathy and Edgar. Linton is weak, pale, and lifeless, but Cathy decides to make a pet of him. They get along well until Heathcliff discovers his son is there and orders that the boy be brought to Wuthering Heights. When Heathcliff sees his son for the first time, he rains insults upon him, calling him, among other things, a whey-faced, whining wretch. It is apparent, however, that Heathcliff does not want to harm the boy, for he will be the heir to the Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange estates, and a principal agent in Heathcliff's revenge against Edgar Linton. At first, Cathy misses Linton, but soon she almost forgets about him. Linton, meanwhile, is a virtual invalid, complaining of colds, aches, and pains. Everyone at Wuthering Heights is sick of taking care of him. 3 years later, Cathy, who is now 16, finally sees Linton again. He is tall and delicately handsome, and Nellie describes him as having a grace in his manner that mitigated his defects. Hareton, also a handsome and athletic-looking young man, remains the illiterate clod that Heathcliff has made him. Heathcliff is proud of what he has done to the boy, since Hareton's father, Hindley, had done the same thing to him. But he says on several occasions that he greatly prefers Hareton to his own weakling son. Finding out that Cathy has been at Wuthering Heights, Edgar forbids her to go there again. He tells her what Heathcliff had done to her aunt and mother, but the girl only thinks about a promise she had made to see her cousin Linton again. For weeks she sends notes to Linton until she is discovered and the correspondence cut off. Several months later, Cathy encounters Heathcliff, who tells her that Linton is literally dying of a broken heart from not having seen her. Picking a time when Heathcliff will be gone, Nellie takes Cathy to visit Linton. Linton is playing the role of the invalid and has everyone in the house irritated with his demands. Cathy's visit results in an argument with Linton, but it is patched up and Linton begs Cathy to see him again the next day. Nellie, knowing that Edgar would never agree, forbids Cathy to return. Nellie, however, suddenly becomes ill, and Cathy spends the next 3 weeks taking care of Nellie and her father. She also finds time to visit Linton. For several months, Cathy and Linton continue to meet. But finally a servant tells Edgar about Cathy, and Edgar forbids her to visit Wuthering Heights. Meanwhile, Edgar's health is failing. He begins to worry about what will happen to Cathy, and thinks that Linton might make her a good husband despite Heathcliff. However, he isn't sure of Linton, and is far from being ready to trust his daughter to anyone associated with Heathcliff. The next spring, Edgar writes to Linton asking to see him, but Linton says he is too sick to travel. Linton writes asking to see Cathy, but Edgar is not ready to let her go to Wuthering Heights alone, and he cannot travel. What Edgar doesn't know is that Linton is also dying, and that Heathcliff has his own evil reasons for seeing this marriage take place. Edgar finally agrees to let Nellie take Cathy to meet Linton on the moors between the two estates. Cathy is shocked at how weak and sick Linton is. The second time they visit him, his condition is worse. This time, however, they meet Heathcliff. After he is told that Edgar is dying, he asks Cathy to help him walk Linton back to the house. When they get inside, Heathcliff closes and locks the door, then tells them that the servants are away. Cathy and Nellie realize they are trapped. When Cathy tries to grab the key, Heathcliff beats her about the head, and when Nellie intervenes, she is knocked across the room by him. Cathy, trembling and shocked, is told to go attend Linton. When Heathcliff goes out to get Nellie and Cathy's horses where they left them on the moors, the two women to escape but can't. Linton then tells Cathy that Heathcliff wishes for them to be married. He has planned to have the ceremony performed in the morning without Edgar's approval. Cathy's only reaction to this, however, is to try to escape. There is no chance. Heathcliff is desperate. For him to inherit the property, Edgar must be for Linton, and Linton must be married to Cathy. Kidnapping Cathy and Nellie, then, is part of his insane, desperate plot. The two women are locked in Zilla's room. Early in the morning, Heathcliff comes to get Cathy for the wedding to Linton, but leaves Nellie locked up. She remains in the room 5 more days. After the 5th day, Zilla returns to the house, bringing word that Cathy and Nellie are rumored to have been drowned in Black Horse Marsh on the moors. Heathcliff is amused. He releases Nellie to go home, but when she looks for Cathy, she is told by Linton, "She's upstairs. She's not to go." Then Linton tells her that his father has told him that though Cathy is his wife, she hates him. He refuses to help Nellie find the girl. Finally, Nellie rushes home, hoping to send a rescue party. She goes directly to Edgar's bedside. He is depressed and waiting to die. Nellie does not tell him that Cathy is a captive for fear of upsetting him. Realizing he needs to change his will to thwart Heathcliff's plans, Edgar has Nellie send for his lawyer. At the same time, she sends a rescue party after Cathy. Both missions fail. The lawyer is detained, and Heathcliff convinces the rescue party that Cathy is too sick to travel. Nellie curses their stupidity. At 3 a.m. the next morning, Nellie hears a knock on the door. It is Cathy, who has finally escaped. She rushes to her father's bedside, and the two are reunited just before he dies. Too late, the lawyer finally arrives. He has been bribed by Heathcliff. After the funeral, when Cathy and Nellie are alone, Cathy explains that Linton let her escape from Wuthering Heights, not out of compassion, but because he was afraid of her anger and desperation. Later that night, Heathcliff comes to take Cathy back to Wuthering Heights. Linton needs to be cared for, and Heathcliff does not want to bother with him. Cathy suggests that she and Linton live at the Grange, but Heathcliff says he is looking for a tenant for the place, and that he wants his children to live with him anyway. When Cathy goes to get her things, Heathcliff tells Nellie that he has paid a man to open Catherine's grave and break the side of her coffin away from Edgar. His demented plan is to be buried next to Cathy, with that side of his coffin broken too, so that their remains will decay together. Heathcliff says that on the night of Cathy's funeral, he thought about digging up her body to embrace her one more time. Then he heard a sigh over the stormy churchyard and knew her spirit was free. In his crazed state, he has felt her presence ever since. Once back at Wuthering Heights, Cathy goes directly to Linton. She tells Heathcliff that he needs medical attention, but Heathcliff says he isn't going to spend anything on his worthless son. Cathy does what she can to keep Linton alive, but he dies. It is then revealed that Heathcliff has forced Linton to write a will, leaving everything he controlled, including Cathy's inheritance, to Heathcliff. Heathcliff is heir to the lands through his wife Isabella, and is at last the master of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Cathy is without money or friends, although Hareton tries to befriend her. With that revelation, Nellie has brought Lockwood up to the present. She even suggests that Cathy's only hope is to find a new husband. Once he feels well, Lockwood decides to visit Heathcliff to tell him he will spend the next 6 months in London. Nellie asks him to take a note to Cathy. After Hareton lets him in, Lockwood tries to quietly pass the note to Cathy, but thinking the note is from him, she knocks it to the floor. Hareton picks it up and threatens to give it to Heathcliff when he returns. Cathy begins to cry, and Hareton throws the note at her. Nellie's words help her think back to happier times. During this visit, Cathy and Hareton squabble back and forth, indicating a hidden fondness for each other that Lockwood doesn't recognize. 6 months later, in September of 1802, Lockwood comes to Thrushcross Grange, where he finds that Nellie has moved to Wuthering Heights. Surprised, Lockwood decides to visit her. When he arrives, the front gate is unlocked. Flowers are blooming, and when he looks through the window, he sees Cathy teaching Hareton how to read and giving him kisses when he succeeds. When Lockwood enters, he meets Nellie. When he asks about his rent at Thrushcross Grange, Nellie tells him that he must take that up with Cathy because Mr. Heathcliff has died. He asks her to tell him what has happened. She begins to tell the story, starting first with an explanation of why Wuthering Heights has become so much more cheerful. First, Cathy decided to replace the black currant trees that surrounded the house with flowers she brought from the Grange, and Heathcliff allowed the change. Then it was obvious that Hareton and Cathy were falling in love, and that she had her old spirits back. Also, Hareton was much more willing to stand up for Cathy against Heathcliff, although his loyalties were still divided. Finally, it became apparent that Heathcliff had lost, and that change signaled his decline and eventual death. Over several months, he virtually starved himself to death. At some point in his madness, he began to believe that by dying, he would be reunited with his beloved Catherine. He became happier, more relaxed, and less of a problem to others in the household. Finally, on a cold and rainy night, Nellie noticed that Heathcliff's window was open. She assumed he had gone out and went to his room to close the window. There lay Heathcliff, dead, drenched by a long night of rain. As he had for months, Heathcliff was staring out an open window, looking for Catherine. He is buried next to Catherine, with that side of his coffin broken open. And much to the horror of the village, no services are held. On New Year's Day, 1803, Hareton and Cathy marry. They move to the Grange and leave Wuthering Heights to old Joseph. Although there are similarities between Heathcliff and other villains created by the romantic novelists of the time, he is the one character whom critics believe has never existed before and will never exist again. Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights after the high point of the English Romantic movement. With Heathcliff, she has gone deep into the evil nature of man, while still capturing his nobility and dignity. The novel also may be one of the first to point out clearly that abuse leads to abuse. First, Heathcliff is badly treated by Hindley, and then he abuses both Hareton and Linton. Finally, his lifetime bent on revenge does him in. An interesting theme in the book is the contrast between Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Wuthering Heights is the stormy home where everyone is at each other's throats. It is dark and foreboding and constantly buffeted by wind and storms. Thrushcross Grange is a beautiful, well-landscaped park sheltered from the wild elements. While the people at Wuthering Heights work the land, those at Thrushcross Grange are country squires. At the same time, the people living at Wuthering Heights are more alive. They go from the depths of despair to the heights of great sensitivity and love. And it is Bronte's ability to create and capture these highs and lows that makes Wuthering Heights such a brilliant work.
This is the end of the session.
Into the house through a washroom. Inside, he finds himself in the room where he met Heathcliff. Sitting in the room is a woman called the Mrs. She is sullen-looking and remains silent, not even offering Lockwood a seat. He tries to start a polite conversation, but the woman ignores him. When she is about to make tea, she asks Lockwood if he is an invited guest. When he says no, she puts the tea away. Despite her incivility, Lockwood finds her hauntingly beautiful. She has a lovely figure, an exquisite face, and pretty eyes. With a pleasant expression on her face, Lockwood thinks she would be irresistible. At this point, Heathcliff comes into the room. He is in a foul mood, and is irritated that Lockwood has decided to visit him. Lockwood learns that the Mrs. is Heathcliff's daughter-in-law, Cathy, and that her husband, Heathcliff's son, and Heathcliff's wife are both dead. The young man with a pitchfork is named Hareton Earnshaw, and Lockwood does not remember that the name above the front door was also Hareton Earnshaw. Next, Lockwood asks for someone to guide him across the moors back to his home. He gets no response from Sister Anne as best she could. Their only brother, Branwell, was taught by his father. In 1842, Emily and Charlotte, who became teachers to supplement the family's income, lived for 8 months in Brussels, Belgium, learning French, German, and music. By 1845, the two girls and their younger sister Anne were together at their Haworth home. It was during this period that they discovered their talent for poetry. In 1846, they published a book of poems under the assumed male names of Curre, Ellis, and Acton Bell. When the book sold only 2 copies, the girls turned to the writing of fiction. After Charlotte's first novel, The Professor, failed, she produced Jane Eyre in 1847, which was an enormous hit. Later that same year, Emily's Wuthering Heights and Anne's Agnes Grey were published, also under their assumed male names. Both were also extremely successful. Since it had been speculated that all three books were written by the same author, Charlotte, who helped publish the second edition of Wuthering Heights in 1850, told the world who had actually written the three novels. Hello, and welcome to another session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books, featuring the Instant Expert Learning System. In the 19th century, many women writers had to write under assumed male names to get their works published. Most of them received little or no recognition for their work. This was certainly the case for Emily Bronte, the author of Wuthering Heights, the novel we are featuring in this session. Emily was the fourth daughter of the Reverend Patrick Brontë, a minister of the Church of England from County Down, Ireland, and Maria Branwell Brontë. When Emily was 3, her mother died of cancer, leaving 6 children to be cared for by their strict spinster Aunt Bess and their financially strapped father. In an attempt to educate his daughters, Reverend Bronte sent the 4 oldest sisters to the Clergy Daughters School at Cowan Bridge, where their tuition was supplemented by donations. But the horrible living conditions at the school contributed to the death of the 2 elder daughters, Maria and Elizabeth, from tuberculosis. As a result, Mr. Bronte brought Charlotte and Emily home, where their Aunt Bess taught them, and their younger then, Anne and Emily, had both died. When writing about her sister Emily, Charlotte portrayed her as a person with a fire for writing, but no worldly wisdom. However, Emily's work displayed a grasp of the realities of life that she was forced to deal with every day. The rules of inheritance of the period make up much of the plot in Wuthering Heights, and it is apparent from reading the book that Emily understood these rules as well as any man. Wuthering Heights is considered by many to be the most famous romantic novel in English. It is the story of Mr. Heathcliff and his 2 houses, Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. The story begins in 1801, when the story's principal narrator, Mr. Lockwood, described as a fashionable gentleman, rents Thrushcross Grange, a house in a lonely and desolate corner of northern England. Lockwood tells the reader that the house suits him perfectly because he is proud and antisocial. However, it isn't long until Lockwood decides to visit his landlord at Wuthering Heights. When the 2 men walk into the rustic wood and stone building, Lockwood notices the date 1500 and the name Hareton Earnshaw above the door. Once inside, the host leaves Lockwood and goes to the cellar for some wine. Lockwood tries to be friendly with Heathcliff's dogs, but they attack and have to be called off by Zillah, one of the servants. Although Heathcliff carries out his social responsibilities, it is obvious to Lockwood from the start that the man does not want to see him again. Yet Lockwood considers himself Heathcliff's social equal, has enjoyed his conversation, and plans to return, invited or not. We also learn early in the novel that the term wuthering refers to the wild winds that have ravaged the house during storms for centuries. The house has survived because it is made of large, rugged stones and huge, rough wooden timbers. Inclement weather almost keeps Lockwood from making his second trip to Wuthering Heights. However, he decides to visit anyway, and when he arrives at the house it is snowing hard. He runs up the rock path to the front door, only to find it locked and barred. His furious knocking finally attracts Joseph, the servant, who refuses to admit him. At that moment, a young man carrying a pitchfork suddenly appears and leads Lockwood